A few months ago, I made a video looking at some of Melbourne's forgotten tram lines. Today we'll explore more of these, like the railway trams in the southeast of Melbourne and some old tramways board lines. Let's have a look at some more forgotten tram lines. The first line we're looking at ran from St Kilda Station to Brighton Beach Station. Throughout the 1890s and 1900s, there were repeated demands for an extension of the St Kilda Railway through Elwood and Brighton. However, this would be an expensive and complicated project, particularly given there was not a lot of land available. So the Victorian Railways decided to venture into the tramway business for the first time. On the 5th of May 1906, the Victorian Railway's first tram line from St Kilda to Park Street Middle Brighton was opened. This line began at St Kilda's railway station, running along Grey and Barclay Streets through St Kilda. This section featured two intersections between the broad gauge VR tram and standard gauge MMTB lines. It then continued through Elwood along Mitford Street and Broadway. The line had another intersection with an MMTB tram at Broadway, Glen Huntly and Ormond Roads. This other line was the Point Ormond line, which closed in 1960 and we'll talk about in a minute. It is rumoured that because these lines closed within a year, the four-way track intersection survives beneath the roundabout. Continuing along Ormond Road and then St Kilda Street, the line arrived at its inaugural terminus near Park Street in Brighton. 7 months later, the line was extended to Brighton Beach Station, running along the Esplanade and terminating in front of the station. The line was initially built as single track with numerous passing loops, and it was also the only broad gauge electric tramway in Australia. The depot was located at the corner of St Kilda Street, Head Street and Ormond Esplanade. This depot was involved in a fire on the 7th of March 1907, which destroyed every tram and the entirety of the depot. This was perhaps the line's most notable incident, causing the reconstruction of the depot and acquisition of various trams from Sydney for temporary use. Over the years, the line was duplicated progressively, being fully duplicated by 1915. In 1942, 3 new trams based off the latest MMTB W series design of the time were completed. As a result of heavy wartime use thanks to petrol rationing, the line was in poor condition by the late 1940s and the VR had no capital available to invest in the line. From 1947, the VR began investigating the ongoing viability of the line, and in 1953 eventually reached a conclusion that the line was to be closed. This led to a massive public meeting to oppose the line's closure. After a brief attempt to transfer the line to the MMTB, in 1956 it was announced the line would be closed beyond Elwood Depot. On the 1st of January 1956, the line was closed from Park Street Middle Brighton to Brighton Beach, and 6 months later the line was cut back all the way to Elwood Depot. This just caused patronage to fall even further though, and although the VR attempted to use one-man trams to save costs, this move was blocked by the Tramway Union. In 1958 it was decided to close the remainder of the line, and on the 28th of February 1959, the final tram, number 28, arrived at Elwood Depot. The 3 most advanced cars built in 1942 were sold to the MMTB, with 2 of them used until the 1970s, and both are preserved today, one of which is in operational condition. Most other trams were sold off as sheds and ended up in backyards or on rural properties, with trams 20, 34, 35, 41, 52 and 53 preserved today. As for physical remnants of the line itself, there is almost nothing. The only evidence there ever was a tram are 2 shelters in Brighton, along the Esplanade at Dendy Street and Kinane Street, one of which was unfortunately and fortunately being restored while I was filming this video. The former tram depot was used for several decades as a bus depot before being demolished and turned into townhouses. At the intersection with the old Point Ormond tram line, there's a pole which still faintly reads "Cars stop here" on it, more than 60 years after the last tram actually stopped here. Over the years, there have been numerous proposals to extend what is today the Route 96 along Acland Street to Elwood, probably partly along the old route, but nothing has come of that. The other VR tram line ran south from Sandringham. After the railway to Brighton was extended to Sandringham in 1887, the local council constructed a horse tramway from Sandringham to Cheltenham to encourage local development. However, this tram was not particularly successful and closed partly in 1912 before closing altogether in 1914. Despite this, the area around Black Rock had experienced substantial development by this point. In 1910, an extension of the Sandringham Railway to South Sandringham was recommended, but never completed due to the cost of land acquisition. Instead, in 1913, it was recommended that a tramway be constructed from Sandringham to Black Rock, using a new inland route as opposed to the coastal horse tramway route. In 1914, this was approved by Parliament on the condition that it was constructed to standard gauge to enable future connection to the remainder of the Melbourne network. This route did not open until 1919, however, owing to World War I preventing the VR from obtaining rail and electrical equipment. A 3-road depot was constructed in Sandringham Station Yard, with the line being fully double-tracked, excluding a short section from the depot to the front of Sandringham Station. The route began in the front of Sandringham Station on Station Street, running down Bay and then Fernhill Roads before turning into Royal Avenue. It then turned down Bluff Road, which it followed to the terminus at Balcombe Road. 6 tram cars and 6 trailers were converted to standard gauge and transferred from Elwood to Sandringham Depot to operate the route. In 1921, 4 new crossbench designed tram cars were constructed, with the trailers scrapped. In the meantime, the residents of Beaumaris continued to be isolated in terms of public transport. An extension of the tram line was recommended in 1916 and 1919, but did not progress until the Sandringham City Council agreed to provide a 5-year operating subsidy to the railways to operate the route in 1925. The line was constructed as single track with 2 passing loops and a loop at the terminus, running through the residential back streets of the suburb. Despite its name, the tram did not run along Tramway Parade, which instead got its name from the earlier horse tram. The route opened on the 1st of September 1926, however it was never very successful. There was little development along the extension, giving it the name Bush Tramway, and even with the operating subsidy, the VR ran the line at a massive loss. Thus, exactly 5 years after opening, on the day the subsidy ceased, the line closed on the 31st of August 1931. Even with closure of the Beaumaris extension, the VR were unable to make a profit on the Black Rock Tramway. In the 1930s, the route was converted to one-man operation to enable substantial cost savings. Through the Second World War, the route had massively increased traffic and made a profit for the first time, but maintenance was sparse and route condition was poor. In 1945, the VR announced its plans to convert the line to a bus service, but the local community united in opposition to the closure. The VR thus left the service open. However, after 11 years, the route was in such poor condition that there was no option but closure. On the 5th of November 1956, the line was closed and replaced with a VR bus route, number 600. Today, the only major thing left on the route is the former tram depot at Sandringham. This was converted to a bus depot to operate the replacement bus service, and this is how it survives to this day. This service was known as the Route 901, not to be confused with today's Smart Bus. Today, this route runs from Southland to St Kilda and still follows both the former St Kilda to Brighton and Sandringham to Beaumaris tram lines. Beyond that, aside from 2 massively cut back corners at Sandringham and the corner of Royal Avenue and Bluff Road enabling trams to easily turn the corner, there is basically nothing left. In 1913, the Prahran and Malvern Tramways Trust opened the Elsternwick tram line, running from Glenhuntly and Hawthorn Roads west to Elsternwick Station and east to Grange Road. 2 years later, the western end was extended to the beach at Point Ormond on the 4th of June 1915. This line ran down Glenhuntly Road except for the western terminus, which lay on a very short bit of reserve track. Along the way, it crossed the aforementioned Brighton VR tramway at Broadway Ormond Road. The line was built as double track, predominantly planned for use by passengers travelling for recreation at the beach. The route was initially a semi-main line, but following electrification of the Brighton Road cable tram in 1926, the route became a quiet branch, seeing little traffic at all, as the area was already well served by the VR Brighton tram line for north-south connections. For many years, the line was operated as a shuttle, with smaller one-man trams like the X-Class only running as far as Elsternwick Station. Despite this, the service was still loss-making, which became a problem following the election of the anti-tram Balti government in 1955, which reduced MMTB funding. Among other cutbacks, the MMTB announced the closure of the Point Ormond tram line, which occurred on the 22nd of October 1960. The route was effectively replaced by what is now known as the 246 bus, enabling some cost savings. The route was pulled up in 1961. Today there is basically nothing left. The old Point Ormond tram terminus is now part of a park alongside the water, with no evidence there was ever a tram line bar a small plaque acknowledging its history. There are no tracks present along Glenhuntly Road. At Brighton Road, there are no remains of the former junction with what is now the 67 tram. final line we're looking at is not really a line but instead a siding. The tram stop at Essendon Station was once actually the location of a junction of a short tramway siding. Opened in 1923, the Napier Street or Windy Hill siding was used exclusively for football traffic. It ran for several hundred metres from the corner of Fletcher, Napier, Russell Streets and Mount Alexander Road up to the football stadium. On game days, trams would run from the city and take patrons up to the siding, where all the trams would line up as it was only a single track. After waiting for the game to finish, all the trams would depart one by one until the siding was empty again. This was not the only sport-related siding in Melbourne or indeed Australia. Even today, sidings remain in places like the Showgrounds and Caulfield Racecourse, but perhaps the most impressive setup was in Sydney, where a massive multi-platform tram station was constructed at Randwick Racecourse, more akin to a railway than a tramway. The demise of this tram line came about thanks to the end of regular AFL games at the stadium in 1991. It was left intact for many years, occasionally being used on tram tours and the like, but the wire was partly removed in 2004, with the track and wire fully removed over the next 3 years. You may have noticed that the previous tramway lines had little left, and this line is no exception. Aside from the old tramway poles and an obvious difference in the road texture where the tram track was, nothing remains of this tram line. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm looking at making videos next on perhaps the cable tram lines or some of Melbourne's old tram depots that don't exist anymore. See you in the next video sometime soon.